Hi, welcome to Defcon 3. I'm KT McFarland. The Iranian negotiations over Iran's nuclear weapons program, that is likely to be the major foreign policy legacy of the Obama administration, and yet there's a lot of controversy on how the administration is going about it and what its prospects for success are. Joining me now are the two guys who really have been the most outspoken critics of the president's Iran program. Chris Griffin, who is the executive director of the Foreign Policy Initiative, on the top, and then joining me on the bottom of your screen is Jonathan Schanzer, who's the Vice President for Research for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Chris Griffin, I'm going to ask you first. You know, the Congress has now gotten into the act, and they're proposing legislation that says if Iran doesn't abide by these announced agreements 6 months from now, then there are going to be additional sanctions imposed, and the president's threatened to veto it. What's the best approach that Congress can take to help a good outcome here? Step back or step in?
Well, leading up to and throughout these negotiations, Congress has played the essential role of essentially the bad cop, building pressure on Iran, moving on sanctions throughout whenever the administration wasn't forward-leaning. The deal that's on the table right now, it's going to have its 1-month anniversary on Christmas Eve, and so far the Iranians haven't even agreed to begin the 6-month timeline, let alone what the deal means. By taking this step and telling the Iranians, if you don't negotiate in good faith, not only are sanctions going to stay, they're going to get stronger, is the right step and one that has bipartisan support in the Senate.
Let me turn to you, John. You have done a lot of research on sanctions. You're one of the advocates for imposing them in the first place. You've done a lot of the technical information about what do the sanctions mean, how do you impose them, and how do you lift them. The administration has implied that lifting the sanctions is going to happen sometime in the future, and in any event, it's not going to be very much. And if sanctions are lifted, then they can always be reimposed again. What's your impression of all that?
Well, first of all, I think that the White House's numbers are a little fuzzy. We've come to understand that it's roughly $7 billion of sanctions relief that will be offered to the Iranians over the next 6 months. We've done an assessment of that, looking at the relief that's going to happen with regard to the gold trade, precious metals, the automotive industry, and petrochemicals. And by our count, it looks like the sanctions relief could be as high as $20 billion, which is a pretty significant jump in that figure. But more broadly, you know, we continue to hear about how the environment for investment in Iran appears to be much better for foreign companies. This has always been a calculation of greed versus fear. Fear has dominated up until now, but now that we look like we're about to start removing some of these sanctions, greed is starting to play a factor, and we get a sense that this could also contribute greatly to the Iranian economy.
Let's fast forward into 2014 and say these negotiations, however they end, do not result in Iran rolling back its nuclear program, and at the same time the sanctions are lifting. So I think you've got to assume the Iranian economy booms. What happens to the other countries in the region? Do they just say, okay, Iran, you can be the alpha dog in the region, we're going to step back and allow you to be the most dominant political, economic, and military country in the region, or do they do something, and if so, what do they do? Let me start with you, Chris.
I think you can see that the other countries in the region have not accepted Iran's assertion of its priorities everywhere from Syria, where, of course, the Saudis have been very aggressive in fighting against them, that the Saudis have indicated that they themselves could acquire an atomic weapon if Iran continues to move forward in its program. And there's always a question, and one thing that I would compliment that this bill for speaking to is that Israel may take measures in its own self-defense if it sees the Iranian nuclear program going forward. So the idea that the United States can sit and watch this situation simmer indefinitely is not a reasonable one.
John, let me ask you, some critics of the critics have said, well, you know, the administration is doing the best it can. If it's a choice between either going to war in the Middle East, another war, going to war with Iran to stop Iran's nuclear program, or letting Iran get nuclear weapons, the best thing of all would be not a pleasant solution, a pleasant conclusion, but a nuclear Iran is a lot better than another war in the Middle East. What do you say to that? Is there another option?
Well, I mean, look, I think it's a false distinction. This is not a binary choice. I think that, if you allow Iran to go nuclear and you opt for that so-called containment option, what you're going to see is likely a nuclear cascade on the number one, where other countries around the region develop their own nuclear programs, and that makes the Middle East, on balance, a heck of a lot more of a dangerous place than it already is today. And then also don't forget that a lot of these Arab regimes, which you mentioned, are going to look for ways to extend their power and to undercut Iran. And that basically means the ramping up of that jihadi network that the Saudis were so famous for prior to 9/11 and for the couple of years after, until they started to curb it under U.S. pressure. I think we're already beginning to see that right now, where these Sunni states are looking to project some power to undercut Iran. We're seeing it in Syria. The question is how much more that extends. So I think what you're looking at, if you allow Iran to go nuclear, is a much more dangerous Middle East that will be on tilt and very close to the brink of war for the foreseeable future.
Let me turn to you, Chris. You've got a wider brief on the things that you cover than just the Middle East. What happens to the non-proliferation regime, which has basically kept many nations in the world who would have the ability or the resources to develop nuclear weapons? They have not for the last 20 years. If Iran is a de facto nuclear power, and as you both have suggested, it leads to a Middle East nuclear arms race, what happens to the rest of the world? South Korea, Japan, other countries. Do you think everybody gets nuclear weapons in their arsenal, Chris?
Well, there's a phrase that another scholar, Henry Sokolsky, has used that he describes as a nuclear 1914. Imagine a world in which many other countries have nuclear weapons, and the prospect of the next great war being a nuclear war if it occurs. And even if you have, this is one of the difficult things with the negotiations with Iran, if there is an agreement that allows them to continue to enrich uranium, and that somehow is treated as avoiding war, but instead just leaves Iran as a nuclear threshold state, instead it sends the absolute wrong message to our friends, countries like South Korea, countries like Japan, that look at where Iran is going and what they're trying to do, and ask, particularly in this case of South Korea, why we don't want them to have plutonium reprocessing capabilities. This is a very dangerous model that could be emulated broadly.
Okay, let me ask the critical question and turn to you, John Schanzer from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. You get the last word. Israel has never given up the idea that it might employ a military option against Iran to stop Iran's nuclear program. Do you think 2014 will be the year that they do that?
Look, I think the Israelis are looking at that option very carefully right now. They have been aware of Iran's march toward a nuclear weapon for years now. They've been preparing for this moment. They've made it very clear that they're unhappy with the deal that was struck at Geneva. They believe that it is left, and I think they're correct in their assessment, that the Iranian nuclear program has been left largely intact, and that is their red line, and they have vowed to stop it. So I do think that 2014 could be a pivotal year.
Okay, 2014, the year of reckoning. Thank you so much, Dr. John Schanzer. He's the Vice President of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and author of an extremely good book that you still have time to get on your Christmas list, which is State of Failure. And also joining us has been Chris Griffin. He's the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. It's called FPI. Thanks both to you, and happy holidays and Happy New Year.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.